Hey everyone, John Chappell with you again. This PowerPoint covers feminism and the women's movement of the 1970s, and this is intended to supplement the material you're reading in Eric Foner's book about American culture and society in the 70s, and this is one of the issues he deals with in the pages that you're reading. You see on this slide, I refer to the modern women's movement, and historians like myself teach 20th century American history. We use that term, the modern women's movement, to denote the women's movement as it developed and expanded in the United States after World War II, to kind of distinguish it from earlier women's movements of the 19th and early 20th century that centered around women gaining the right to vote. And the modern women's movement grew, expanded, developed exponentially in the 1960s into the 1970s. And for younger women who participated in it, many of them drew upon experience and leadership skills that they gained in other movements of the era that I mentioned here, specifically the civil rights movement, student movements of various sorts on college campuses, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. Eric Foner mentions the importance of the work of Betty Friedan in influencing the modern women's movement. Friedan was a writer, freelance writer, who, like many women in the post-World War II era, married young, started a family, started doing research after she went to a college reunion in the 1950s where she was really struck by the lack of ambition expressed by young women that she met who were saying, well, when I finish college, my intention is just to get married and start a family. She started researching the messages that young women were being exposed to through the media, particularly in the 1950s, when there was this tremendous emphasis during the baby boom on women marrying young and starting families. And in many ways, popular culture defined women's roles in the 1950s, specifically within that sphere of marriage and motherhood. And so Betty Friedan researched and produced a book about this, The Feminine Mystique, that Eric Foner mentions, that came out in 1962. And this book created a sensation. It became an immediate bestseller. Millions of women responded with letters to Betty Friedan, kind of saying, "You finally identified what I've been feeling." And so she went from being a very successful and talented writer to a national figure within the women's movement. Feminine Mystique had a huge impact on American culture when it came out and shaped the women's movement as it developed in the 60s and 70s as well. Another important development that Foner mentions, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We talked about this when we talked about Lyndon Johnson, that created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which was a federal entity designed to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex in employment in particular. And Betty Friedan became one of the key figures establishing a new organization in the aftermath of the establishment of the EEOC through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this was NOW, the National Organization for Women, that appeared first in 1966. This is when it formed. And you see the picture to the right, one of the early demonstrations in New York City, but its focus was, as that banner says, equal job and educational opportunities. By the late 60s, you had the first feminist writings appear. This is just one example of many. Robin Morgan produced a collection of essays, Sisterhood is Powerful, that came out in 1969. hugely influential in the women's movement into the 1970s and remains one of the most famous early feminist works. African American women were active and highly visible within the women's movement as well. One of the first groups, NBFQ, the National Black Feminist Organization, or excuse me, NBFO, National Black Feminist Organization. And what was interesting as the women's movement developed is that while there was a great deal of unity amongst Black and white feminist activists, they also had major disagreements on a number of issues, centering around race and gender both. Historically, for Black women, work hadn't been viewed as liberating in the sense that Black women really from the beginning, I mean, obviously starting with slavery and even after slavery was abolished, in many cases had to work. It wasn't a choice. And so there was a difference of perspective historically in that sense between Black feminists and white feminists who regarded entering the workforce as a form of liberation. Examples of prominent African American feminists included Alice Walker, best known as author of the novel The Color Purple that comes out later, and Angela Davis, controversial figure of the 60s and 70s, a philosophy professor. You see her speaking at a rally in Oakland. Controversial because she was a member for several years of the American Communist Party, actively involved with the Black Panthers. She's written some terrific books, including this book, Women, Race, and Class, and a book I love that I've actually used in a class here in the past, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, which is a study of 3 impactful African American singers, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday. African American women's feminism was also exemplified by Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, the first African American woman elected to U.S. Congress from New York. This happened in 1968, and the first Black candidate from either major party, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, to seek party's presidential nomination when she participated in Democratic Party primaries in 1972, eventually losing out to the Democratic candidate in that election, Senator George McGovern. As the 70s developed, more women emerged in the women's movement as voices on behalf of feminism. 2 of the most famous became Gloria Steinem, that you see to the left in the slide, who founded Ms. Magazine, and Kate Millett, who published this influential book, Sexual Politics, that came out in the 1960s as well. I misspoke on the previous slide saying that Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, came out in the 60s. It came out in the 1970s. One thing I wanted to note with both of them, and this was reflective of continued persistent sexism in the mainstream media, you can see here by the respective covers of Newsweek and Time magazines, the mainstream media tended to treat Gloria Steinem more favorably, Newsweek putting her on the cover as representative of the new woman because she was deemed physically attractive, whereas Time used a much less flattering artistic depiction of Kate Millett. On this cover story you see on the right of the slide, simply saying Kate Millett of Women's Lib. Eric Foner briefly mentions Title IX, which was passed in 1972 during the Nixon administration. Richard Nixon signed this into law. Extremely significant piece of legislation. co-authored and introduced by Congresswoman Patsy Mink of Hawaii, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, two Democrats who introduced this. And what this act did was to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program that was supported by federal funds. And the interpretation of this took a number of years, along with the implementation of it, but historically, probably its most impactful aspect was that it becomes the basis of the expansion of women's sports at all levels, really through secondary school and college. And finally, I want to say just a few things about the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, that Eric Foner talks about. The idea of an Equal Rights Amendment dated all the way back to the 1920s, and the first one had been proposed in the early 20s, 1923, and is reintroduced in 1971. You see here in the slide, this is all it said. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. It passed Congress, passed the Senate, but over the next several years, it failed to win the approval of the required 38 states to become an amendment. And this is still the case today. It's never been approved by sufficient number, 38 states as required. The leader of the fight against the Equal Rights Amendment, a woman from my hometown of Alton, Illinois, Phyllis Schlafly, who just passed away a couple years ago, a longtime Republican activist. She is an interesting character in 20th century American history because she was the opposite of what she advocated. She was a professional woman, an attorney. She was never a stay-at-home mom. And yet she argued that equal rights would threaten what she termed the special status of women. And the special mission is another term she used frequently, that women had to be wives, mothers, homemakers. Phyllis Schlafly used a lot of scare tactics. One of the ones that sounds ridiculous now but was very impactful at the time is she argued that the entire world would become one big unisex bathroom if ERA were passed, that men and women would be forced to use the same bathroom. There were a number of ridiculous claims like that she used, and she was a very effective speaker. And her grassroots organization, Eagle Forum, was really the main organization that led the fight against ERA. So I note here in this final slide that the women's movement from the 60s had two parallel paths, and these continued in the 1970s. And impacted the movement as it developed then. You had professional women like Betty Friedan forming organizations like NOW that focused more on women's issues at the legislative level, and particularly issues centering around women in the workplace. Younger women who came out of other movements, civil rights, student movements, the anti-war movement, focused more on working in the community level with other women and dealing with issues personally, but in a way that obviously had political implications. And that strategy involved in the late 60s and into the early 70s forming what were called consciousness-raising groups, which were groups that anybody could form, where women got together and simply discussed these issues and strategized on ways to make their voices heard politically, but working with a different sort of approach than organizations like NOW. And both of these strategies influenced the direction of the women's movement as it developed in the 1970s.